Welcome to Stuff You Missed in History Class, a production of iHeartRadio.
Hello and welcome to the podcast. I'm Tracy V. Wilson.
And I'm Holly Fry.
Last year, when we took our podcast trip to Barcelona, during some of our kind of unscheduled time in Barcelona, my spouse and I walked down to the Maritime Museum, and there were some submarine models there that really caught my eye. They had been designed by Catalan inventor Narcís Monturiol, and I found them to just be really beautiful and intriguing. They looked kind of like a very well-made wine barrel, but if a wine barrel was shaped more like a torpedo or a fish. And based on the very brief descriptions on the signs there, it seemed like these submarines worked a little bit better than a lot of other submarines of their era. So, like so many other things, that went on the list. Narcís Monturiol lived through a lot of the 19th century upheavals in Spain and Catalonia that we talked about in our episode on Montjuic Castle that came out on December 6th of last year. We don't rerun episodes that recent as Saturday Classics, but I do feel like it helps kind of contextualize some of the stuff that was going on in a lot more detail than we're going to get into today. But that does mean, before we get to the really cool submarines, we are going to talk about Monturiol's time fighting for ideals like equality and freedom and progress in the middle of just a ton of social and political chaos.
Narcís Monturiol y Estarriol was born in September of 1819. Some sources say on the 28th and others say on the 29th. He was born in Figueres in northern Catalonia, northeast of Barcelona. And he was one of 5 children. Their father was a cooper, so in other words, a barrel maker. Under the inheritance laws of the day, Narcis's older brother was the one who would inherit their father's business. So the plan for Narcis, which was the plan for a lot of second sons, was that he would join the priesthood.
So to that end, he studied at a monastery in Figueres and then at the University of Cervera. At the time, this was the only university in Catalonia, and some sources describe the education that he got there as more comparable to today's high schools than to college. But he just wasn't all that interested in the subjects that would have been most relevant to going on to joining the priesthood, things like philosophy, Latin, and Greek. In terms of academics, he was more interested in things like science and medicine.
Before long, he was also more interested in revolution than in schoolwork. In 1833, either on his 14th birthday or the day after, King Fernando VII of Spain died. As we discussed in the Montjuic episode from last December, Fernando's heir was his daughter Isabella II, who was only 3. But Isabella was only in line for the throne because of a decree her father had issued that allowed for a woman to become the Spanish monarch. Fernando's brother Carlos would have been next in line without that decree, and Carlos declared himself king. This led to the First Carlist War, which continued until 1839.
Broadly speaking, Isabella's side was more liberal and progressive, while the Carlists were more conservative. And people who wanted to go even farther than a more liberal monarchy also started a movement for democracy in Spain. By the age of 16, Narcís had moved to Barcelona, where his social circle was filled with revolutionaries and activists. One of his friends and frequent collaborators was Abdo Terradas, who had been born in Figueres as well. Abdo Terradas was a socialist who advocated for Spain to become a republic.
The University of Barcelona was reestablished in 1836, and Narcís seems to have enrolled there to study law. But there are some discrepancies about whether he graduated. He never described himself as a lawyer or practiced law, and there were times in his life when he really needed money. And it seems like if he'd had a law degree, he might have had more opportunities to earn it. At the same time, the style and quality of his writing suggests that he had more advanced education than he would have gotten at the University of Cervera, which had been declining in quality and ultimately closed in 1835. Some sources say he never graduated from the University of Barcelona because he was so focused on his activism, and others say it was because he kept giving his tuition money to support the cause, Kind of two different flavors of the same thing.
Yeah, yeah. Between 1835 and 1855, so for 20 years, Monturiol launched or worked at a whole series of radical and revolutionary periodicals, and this was an ongoing cycle. He and some compatriots would start a newspaper or a journal or a publishing house. Then they would print a whole bunch of material criticizing the Carlists or the government or Baldomero Espartero, who was Queen Isabella's regent, or advocating for socialism or democracy or revolution. Soon the police would show up and shut down the press and arrest everybody, sometimes also storming their homes or their businesses. At various points, Monturiol was fled or was sent into exile, first to Girona, then to his hometown of Figueres, and then to the coastal town of Cadaqués. As soon as he could, he would make his way back to Barcelona, and he would just do that all over again. He also published treatises of his own, including one that advocated against the death penalty in 1844.
He was also a member of La Milicia Nacional, or the National Militia, which fought against the Spanish military during a number of popular uprisings and other unrest. We talked about several of these in the Montjuic episode. He was involved in two different uprisings that authorities dealt with in part by bombarding the city of Barcelona from the castle at Montjuic.
In the middle of all this, Monturiol also tried to find ways to make money. He learned to paint from his friend Ramon Martí Alsina, who was considered to be one of the most important painters in Catalan realism, and from time to time he made some money as a portrait artist. He also invented things, including a printing machine that could print and cut the lined paper used for children's notebooks. Another invention was a cigarette rolling machine, which could make 45 cigarettes a minute and then put them into a box.
Monturiol also worked as a tutor, including tutoring his landlord's daughter. Her name was Amelia, and as has been the case several times on the show recently, their relationship gets a yikes when it's seen through a modern lens. In addition to the fact that he was her tutor, when Narcís and Amelia got married, he was 26 and she was 16. The two of them had very similar social and political views, and they seem to have had a happy and loving relationship that lasted for the rest of their lives. With all of Narcis's various exiles and other travels, they were sometimes separated for long periods, and their letters to one another during these times are very loving and devoted, although there were times, especially later in Narcis's life, when their circumstances did seem to cause them some strain. Amelia and Narcís would go on to have 8 children together, although only 3 of those children lived to adulthood.
The year they got married, Monturiol started publishing a journal called La Madre de Familia, which promoted the role of women in families from kind of a proto-feminist perspective. This was definitely underpinned by the idea that women had a natural family role, but he also called for equal legal and political rights and access to education for women, and for women to have protections against men who could mistreat or harm them. This journal, like so many of Monturiol's periodicals, was short-lived, though. It lasted for only 8 weeks. When it closed, he started another one called La Fraternidad, which advocated for the advancement of all of humanity, regardless of sex.
In 1847, Monturiol was introduced to the work of French philosopher and writer Étienne Cabet. Cabet was a communist who had written a utopian novel called Voyage to Icaria 7 years before. Cabet thought that for most of history, a small, wealthy minority had been exploiting everyone else, with that exploitation taking a series of forms, including serfdom, slavery, and unfair economic structures. He thought communism was the only way to resolve this, and he wanted to establish a communist utopia called Icaria, like in his novel, in the real world. We might talk more about this later, as in during a whole different episode.
Yeah, this is not even, it doesn't even scratch the surface of Étienne Cabet, really. Monturiol helped translate Cabet's book and published a periodical for Cabet's followers. The Monturiols also contributed some money to Cabet's efforts to buy land in Texas for his utopian project. After Cabet and his followers departed for the U.S. in 1848, Monturiol continued to promote his ideas in Catalonia. Of course, these writings also once again caught the attention of authorities, especially as a series of revolutions swept across parts of Europe in 1848. And Monturiol once again went into exile, this time in France.
Monturiol returned to Barcelona in 1849, possibly because an amnesty had been announced at the end of the Second Carlist War. From here, his activism became slightly more tempered. While he had previously been part of the militia, his rhetoric became more pacifist. He still advocated for a revolution, but not a violent one. That didn't stop authorities from shutting down his publications, though, including his pro-democracy El Padre de Familia, Father of the Family. That was shut down by judicial order in 1850.
Around this time, Monturiol started spending a bit more time studying science and nature, but he didn't entirely stop his radical publishing. He founded a secret publishing circle called El Corto in 1853, and when he once again fell under suspicion, they disbanded. After almost 2 decades of this, of just like starting things and being shut down and being exiled and starting and shut down and exiled over and over, he was starting to get discouraged. And for a while, he thought about joining the Icarians in the United States. Ultimately, though, he decided to stay in Barcelona.
In 1854, Spain embarked on a period of reform called the Bienio Progresista, or the Progressive Biennium. For a very brief moment, Monturiol was able to openly advocate for many of his ideals without the threat of arrest or exile. He was a speaker at the first meeting of a newly established Republican Party, where he steered clear of the idea of communism and focused on topics like freedom, equality, and the separation of church and state. His speech there was well received, but the Progressive Biennium was short-lived, ending just a year later when conservatives retook control. After that, Monturiol was, once again, exiled.
This exile really changed his life, which we will get to after a sponsor break. After the end of the Progressive Biennium, Narcís Monturiol went into exile in the seaside town of Cadaqués, while his wife Amelia and their 2 daughters went to live with his mother in Figueres. He tried to make ends meet there by painting portraits. He also wrote poetry, and he grieved. By this point, he and his wife had lost 2 children. Emilio had died in 1849 at the age of 12 months, and Filomena in 1854 at the age of 4 years. Abdo Terradas and Etienne Cabet also both died in 1856. They had each been enormously influential on Monturiol and on his work and ideals, so with their deaths really pretty close together, he lost 2 of his biggest inspirations and collaborators.
While in Cadaqués, Monturiol also spent time watching divers collect Mediterranean red coral. This coral was used as a gemstone, including polishing and shaping it to make jewelry, beads, and artwork. Of course, red coral has its own, much bigger story, one that is connected to slavery, globalization, environmentalism, and a range of spiritual and religious beliefs and practices. But Monturiol's focus was on the divers and the dangers of their work. These were usually men who worked from boats in pairs. One would dive to the seafloor, sometimes as deep as 20 meters below, and stay down for as long as they could hold their breath, cutting and breaking pieces of coral to then carry back to the boat. Then the other would dive in and repeat the process. This all carried obvious risks of injuries or drowning, and sometimes there were also sharks in the water.
During one of his earlier periods of exile in Cadaqués in 1845, Monturiol had reportedly saved a diver who had been pulled out of the water and was not breathing. In the account of this, Monturiol lifted the man up by his feet so that gravity would force the water out of his lungs. This can force some water out of a person's lungs, but this is not what's typically advised in cases of drowning today because it can cause vomiting and delay the start of CPR or rescue breathing. So this experience led Monturiol to start thinking about a way to make a vessel that could go totally underwater, equipped with arms and a basket so that people could gather coral from safely inside of it. And then now back in Cadaqués a decade later, he started actually working on this.
This involved learning everything he could about existing technologies for surviving underwater. This started with diving bells, which date back to at least the 4th century BCE. We talked about this more in our episode on the history of diving technology, which ran as a Saturday classic in November of 2023. And then from there, Monturiol learned about the work of English mathematician William Bourne, who served in the Royal Navy and wrote on ideas for controlling buoyancy in a completely submerged boat, something that is critical to the successful operation of a submarine.
He also studied descriptions of a submarine called the Turtle, developed by David and Ezra Bushnell of Connecticut, which was used in attempts to attach mines to British warships during the American Revolution. The Turtle had an air-filled chamber to help control its depth in the water, and it had a propeller that was driven by treadles or cranks. This was actually the first known use of a propeller on a watercraft.
Monturiol also knew about the work of Robert Fulton, better known for inventing the first practical steamship. Fulton built a submarine called the Nautilus for Napoleon in 1800. And then there was Wilhelm Bauer, who built submarine prototypes for several nations starting in 1851. Bauer's 2 primary prototypes both failed. One after unexpectedly sinking to the seafloor and starting to leak, and the other after getting stuck on the seafloor after intentionally coming to rest there. In both cases, the crews managed to escape. And Monturiol knew about Bauer's work as well, which was as useful as much for his innovations as for picking apart what had gone wrong and how to prevent those problems.
Monturiol's plans for his submarine were ambitious. These names that we just mentioned were only a very few of the people who had worked on some kind of submersible vessel. And by the 19th century, there were a lot of people in a lot of different countries who had at least built some kind of submarine prototype. Most of these were meant to stay fairly close to the surface of the water. For example, Robert Fulton considered the Nautilus to be safe to a depth of about 8 meters or roughly 26 feet. So not nearly as far down as those coral divers would go that we talked about earlier. Monturiol wanted to build a submarine that could go all the way down to the bottom of the ocean, which he estimated to be about 8,000 meters deep. That's much deeper than the average ocean depth of 3,682 meters, but not nearly as deep as the deepest parts of the ocean, which are more than 10,000 meters deep.
In addition to giving coral divers a safer way to work, he thought such a vessel could help fishers, salvage operators, and other people who worked on the sea. He also imagined the ocean as a whole new continent to explore. He thought of this submarine as something that would bring scientific and social progress, a new way to promote his earlier ideals of social justice and equality. So many submarine projects up to this point had been done for military purposes, and he understood that what he was working on could have a potential military use, but he thought of his submarine as something that would have only a defensive role.
He was so idealistic about all of this, and I really kind of love it about him. Working on this submarine really became his entire focus. While he still supported progressive political causes and the idea of democracy for Catalonia and Spain, he was now trying to do this through science and imagination. He started looking for people to fund his project, and by 1857, he had 20 backers. He made his way back to Barcelona. He reunited with his family, and they found a place to live near the shipyard. In 1858, he presented his research on what he called submarine navigation to his backers. This synthesized everything into a plan for a vessel that would include navigational systems, propulsion, and a renewable air supply.
Monturiol knew that the strongest material and shape for his submarine would be a sphere made of metal. But a sphere wasn't practical for the size of vessel he wanted to build, and he just didn't have enough money for something that was made entirely of metal. So he designed his submarine to have a double hull, the first known submarine to be built this way. And this combination of an outer hydrodynamic hull and an inner pressure hull is still used in a lot of submarines today. The inner hull of Monturiol's submarine was an ellipsoid shape, not quite as strong as a sphere, but still pretty close. It was made of olive wood staves with oak supports, covered in copper 2 millimeters thick so that it would be watertight. The outer hull was also made of wood, about 7 meters long and roughly resembling a fish, with a propeller in the tail. The crew turned this propeller using a screw on the inside of the vessel. There were also fins to steer and portholes for visibility.
The space between these two hulls would be flooded with seawater when the vessel submerged, so only the inner hull had to be able to withstand the pressure of the ocean. The water-filled space in between the two hulls was also home to the ballast tanks and what Monturiol described as flotation bladders. These air bladders use the interplay between water pressure and air pressure to adjust the vessel's buoyancy. There was a movable weight inside the vessel that could adjust its center of gravity, and weights mounted to the outside that could be released so that the submarine could still surface again if something went wrong with those flotation bladders. Monturiol thought this vessel could safely withstand the ocean's pressure down to a depth of about 500 meters. But for the sake of safety, he approved it only to 50 meters.
Monturiol also wanted to find a way to provide oxygen and fresh air to his submarine while submerged. He studied fish physiology to see if he could figure out a way to extract oxygen from the surrounding seawater. He did not find a way to do that, and the method he found to produce oxygen on board involved a chemical reaction that involved sulfuric acid. That was unsafe, so he limited his dives to the amount of time that his crew of 5 or 6 people would have enough oxygen, supplemented with bottled oxygen for longer dives. The interior of the submarine was also lit by a candle, which also used up some of the oxygen. But the size and color of the flame also gave a visual indication of when that oxygen was about to run out.
While he had to set aside his method for oxygen production, he did develop a way to scrub the exhaled carbon dioxide from the air inside his submarine. The air inside the sub was pumped through a container of calcium hydroxide, and that would cause the carbon dioxide to precipitate out of it as calcium carbonate.
To be clear, while these were Monturiol's ideas and designs, he did not build this ship all by himself. He had a lot of support from people who were affiliated with the Barcelonan Industrial School. Josep Misé Castells acted as master boat builder, and naval architect Juan Moño worked on the design, basically turning Monturiol's ideas into plans that builders could follow to make a functioning submarine.
Monturiol called this submarine Ictineo, drawn from Greek words meaning fish vessel. He launched it for the first time in Barcelona on June 28, 1859, and he had an immediate setback. Almost as soon as the submarine hit the water, it ran into hidden pilings that were under the water's surface, and it had to be repaired. He really didn't have the time or money or materials to do all of the repairs that he thought were necessary. So he did what he could, and then he limited the Ictineo's dives to 20 meters depth rather than 50.
Monturiol took the Ictineo through more than 20 test dives in the summer of 1859. Many of these dives lasted more than 2 hours, and one lasted more than 4, with the crew provided with bottled oxygen. And people in Barcelona got really excited about this vessel. A public demonstration on September 23rd was carried out before huge, cheering crowds.
Monturiol still had a lot of really idealistic thoughts about the humanitarian possibilities of his submarine, and he was getting a lot of popular enthusiasm and support, including what were basically fan organizations that formed to try to raise money for him. But he recognized that to get the kind of funding he would need to build a ship that could really get all the way to the bottom of the ocean, he would need the backing of the government or the Spanish Navy. He was envisioning something truly massive with hundreds or even more than 1,000 people on the crew.
He started requesting government funds by the end of 1859. Publicly, he was still talking about the possibilities for exploration and research and scientific progress, but he tried to get the Navy interested with the idea of a submarine as a defensive tool. If Spain had a vessel that could approach and destroy British ships completely undetected, then Britain might just stay away from Spain.
By 1861, Monturiol and his ship were international news. English-language newspapers in multiple countries carried a report that said, quote, "A Spaniard named Señor Monturiol is declared to have discovered the means of constructing a vessel by means of which he and a crew can live at the bottom of the sea." That same year, the Spanish government announced that it would fund the building of a new Ictineo. Monturiol had some concerns about this announcement. He had been trying to get government funding, but he just wasn't confident that the government would actually follow through, and the announcement also put an end to all of those public fundraising efforts.
Then the Ictineo was destroyed in 1862 when a freighter accidentally ran into it while it was docked in Barcelona harbor. So Monturiol built a second submarine, and we're going to talk about that after we pause for another sponsor break.
When the Ictineo was destroyed in Barcelona harbor in 1862, Narcís Monturiol started working on a replacement, and he did so without that government backing that had been announced the year before. That money never actually materialized. Some of the generals who had been connected to all this were transferred to Havana, and that meant there was increasing interest in submarine technology in Cuba. That did not actually help Monturiol, though. He was still in Barcelona.
The Ictineo II was 17 meters long, so 10 meters longer than his earlier submarine. Aspects of the Ictineo II were similar to the Ictineo I. It was once again a submarine with an inner and outer hull and a fish-like shape. He also worked with Juan Maño and Joseph Misset again on getting the second one built.
Since the new submarine had a bigger interior volume, there was more air available. So even with a crew of about 16 rather than 5 or 6, it could potentially stay submerged for a lot longer. But that longer time underwater increased the need to remove excess carbon dioxide from the air, as well as removing odors and microorganisms. So Monturiol created a more sophisticated system to circulate and purify the air, including a different way he figured out to produce oxygen that was from a chemical reaction involving manganese dioxide and potassium chlorate.
Monturiol launched the Ictineo II for the first time on October 2nd, 1864, and he continued to refine the design until May of the following year. From there, he took longer test dives, going to depths of about 30 meters for as long as 7 hours. During one of these trials, on June 16th, the Ictineo II developed a leak. Back on the surface, Monturiol realized the iron screws holding the inner hull's copper sheathing together had rusted, and one of them had dislodged, something that had not been an issue on the Ictineo I at shallower depths. Monturiol replaced all of the screws with ones made from copper or bronze.
In December of 1865, still hoping to get government or military support, Monturiol mounted a cannon on the outside of the Ictineo II, and he tested it in the waters off of Barcelona. So the submarine would approach the surface, fire the cannon, and immediately dive again, kind of replicating what might happen during a stealth mission at sea. He apparently didn't really tell anybody he was going to do this or get permission for doing it, so officials did not find this intriguing. They found it pretty alarming. It did not bring in the funding that he was hoping for.
Then, in 1866, even though he hadn't been writing revolutionary newspapers or fighting in a populist militia for more than a decade, He was arrested under suspicion of being involved in a plot against the Queen. He was eventually released, but this interrupted his work and his efforts to get funding.
These efforts included writing to Gideon Welles, the U.S. Secretary of the Navy. Monturiol was offering his services in the U.S. Civil War. Monturiol did not know until receiving Welles's reply that the war had actually already ended by that point. Monturiol also patented his earlier invention of a cigarette machine, hoping that he could use this as a source of income. In 1867, he tried to establish a company to produce and distribute these machines, but he wasn't able to get the interest of cigarette manufacturers. Also, while Monturiol had imagined this as a labor-saving device that would help the people who rolled cigarettes by hand to the workers who did those jobs, it was a machine that was going to replace them. By 1872, he had one working machine that was destroyed in a factory riot. He was eventually compensated for its loss, but that took years. He later made a smaller tabletop version of this machine that did actually bring him a little bit of income.
News was also continuing to spread about Monturiol's work outside of Spain. In 1866, this snippet was picked up in newspapers around the world. Quote, a Madrid letter in the Paris Temps states that M. Monturiol, a Spaniard, has solved the problem of submarine steam navigation by the invention of a vessel which can remain for hours at a considerable depth, can discharge cannons from below, and even act as a ram for piercing ironclad ships. The Perthshire Advertiser ran this with the heading, wonderful if true.
That seems like something that somebody would put on social media with the screenshot of the news story, big if true. The Liverpool Mercury also printed a letter from a JF asking if anyone had heard of a submarine demonstration a couple of years back. He described this public demonstration as something, quote, told by an eyewitness to him. This letter ended by saying the author did not recall seeing any mention of this in English newspapers and being very curious about it because such a thing seemed to violate the known laws of physics. This letter writer wrote, quote, and if what I have heard stated is practicable, might not the power obtained be applied to something useful? In the search for the lost Atlantic cable, for example, or the laying of a new one. If this lost Atlantic cable sounds intriguing, we have an episode on that, which we ran as a Saturday Classic in May of 2023. Like that other piece, this letter from JF was picked up in a lot of other English language newspapers.
Back in Barcelona, Monturiol was trying to figure out how to give his submarine an engine because, like the original Ictineo, it was very, very slow, and it required crew members to continually exert themselves. He had proposed the idea of a submarine with an electric motor years before, but at the time, electric motors really weren't powerful enough for this purpose. The batteries needed to keep one running underwater also probably would have filled the entire vessel. So he tried to find a way to use a steam engine instead.
Steam engines had become a primary source of power in the 19th century, and Robert Fulton's North River steamboat, which we alluded to earlier, that had been launched way back in 1807. But you could not just burn a whole bunch of coal in an enclosed, airtight vessel underwater. Monturiol did outfit the Ictineo II with a coal-powered boiler, but that was only used when the submarine was traveling on the surface of the water, and it was possible to move fresh air into the submarine and coal exhaust out of it. For underwater purposes, he used a chemical reaction instead. He experimented with thousands of combinations before arriving at proportions of zinc, manganese dioxide, and chlorate that produced both oxygen and heat. So that was going to give more oxygen to the interior of the submarine as well as the heat to run the boiler. And then it also produced zinc oxide, which could be collected and sold. He made these rod-like fuel containers to deliver the chemicals into the boiler in very precise amounts.
The engine that ran off this reaction was designed by Joseph Pasquale Diop, who was also the first formally trained engineer to work on one of Monturiol's projects. He also, incidentally, later married Monturiol's oldest daughter. Getting this engine into the interior of the Ictineo II was difficult. They had to take it apart and move it piece by piece through a hatch that was only about 1.5 feet wide.
As Monturiol was working on this in August of 1867, he heard that police were coming to arrest him and he had to flee. This was again because his earlier political activities had made him a suspect in something recent that he wasn't actually involved with. He was able to return, but this was another disruption at a pretty critical time as he was trying to finish his work on the submarine.
Work was finished on the coal burner for surface travel in October of 1867, and the underwater engine was finished that December. And both the chemical reaction and the engine powered by it worked, but it also made the inside of that submarine incredibly hot. While earlier dives had lasted up to 8 hours, with the underwater engine running, crews could only stay submerged for about 20 minutes. By that point, the temperature inside had climbed to about 50 degrees Celsius or 122 degrees Fahrenheit.
What Monturiol really wanted to do was to create a whole new submarine, one that was purpose-built to work with this specific engine and fuel source. But he had already spent about 4 times as much money on the Ictineo II as he had on the Ictineo I. So he worked on plans for a cooling system with copper pipes that would be cooled by the ocean water that could be added to this existing submarine.
But he didn't get a chance to carry out this modification. He and the company he'd established to do this work were deeply in debt, and other economic issues were playing out throughout Barcelona. A shipyard that had been the project's major financial backer demanded the debt be paid off, and there was nothing to pay it with. Monturiol had to fire all of his employees near the end of December 1867. A court ordered his assets to be seized the following February. The Ictineo II was sold for scrap, and its underwater engine was sent to a wheat processing plant where it was repurposed.
Monturiol was devastated. He really thought he would have gotten a submarine that could stay underwater indefinitely if only he had gotten enough money to cool the engine system. And the public was still really fascinated by the idea of underwater travel and exploration. Jules Verne's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea came out as a serial starting in early 1869, and Monturiol's submarines are cited as one of the inspirations for Jules Verne's Nautilus.
Monturiol wrote a book about his efforts, titled Essay on the Art of Navigating Underwater. He finished that work in 1870, and while the writing process seems to have helped him recover emotionally from the end of his submarine project, at least somewhat, he couldn't find a publisher for it. Then, in late 1871 and early 1872, 2 of his children died of tuberculosis, 17-year-old Adelaida and 13-year-old Delphina.
Queen Isabella II was driven into exile in 1868 and abdicated in 1870. She was succeeded by Italian Prince Amadeo I, who was then overthrown in 1873. And then after that, Spain was briefly a republic. Monturiol served as a deputy in the first Republican Parliament. He moved to Madrid, where he was made a director at the National Factory of Stamps. In that role, he worked out a faster drying glue so that the factory could get enough stamps into production to meet a government-ordered deadline involving a new tax.
The Spanish monarchy was restored in 1874, which was during the Third Carlist War. During this war, Monturiol designed a couple of cannons, one of which was destroyed in the process of testing it. The Third Carlist War ended in 1876 with a new constitution that established Spain as a constitutional monarchy.
2 years later, apparently just desperate for work, Monturiol took an administrative job at a monarchist newspaper called La Corona. Within a year, he had left and started working as a clerk at a brokerage. He developed emphysema, and then he died on September 6th, 1885, at the age of 65. He was buried alongside the 5 children who he had survived. His book on his submarines remained unpublished until 1891.
Monturiol left behind all kinds of notes and plans for his inventions and experiments. In addition to the ones that we've discussed, there were chemistry experiments involving winemaking techniques, a formula for wood glue, and a method for chemically preserving meat. He also worked on designing a sewing machine based on work that he'd heard was being done in the U.S.
A 1903 book on the history of submarines summed up Monturiol's submarines this way, quote, "Such an invention should indeed have altered the world's history, yet, strange as it may seem, El Ictineo, with all its perfection, effected nothing and was presently forgotten, as had been all its predecessors." This was also true of Monturiol's immediate successor in Spain, Isaac Peral y Caballero, who designed the first submarine to be officially commissioned by the Spanish Navy in 1888. This submarine was also the first electrically powered submarine in the world. After a change in leadership, the Spanish Navy seemingly just lost interest and shelved this project. As all of this was happening, various people mentioned Monturiol in their articles about the Peral submarine, or they wrote remembrances of him. Both of these men, though, were largely forgotten. Just kind of a gap in people caring about submarines until shortly before World War I.
Today, there are a couple of monuments to Narcís Monturiol. One is in Barcelona, shaped like one of his submarines in kind of an irregular pillar. There's also a monument in his hometown of Figueres, and various streets and schools are named after him, including in places he lived or spent time in exile.
If you want to know more about this, I know of one book written in English, and it is Monturiol's Dream, the Submarine Inventor Who Wanted to Save the World by Matthew Stewart. It was one of the many sources used in this episode, and I think it's very good. It also has just a ton more detail about what was happening in Barcelona and more broadly in Spain during all this. It also has more detail about Etienne Cabet and the Icarians, which, again, the more I learned about that in the brief amount of focus that I spent learning about that, the more I was like, okay, I'm reshuffling what's happening next on my calendar because we need to talk about another failed utopian experiment. It's been a while.
Do you, in the meantime, have English language listener mail?
I do have English language listener mail. This is from Kelly. And Kelly wrote an email that is titled Gene Stratton Porter and My Family Legacy. And Kelly wrote, "Hello, Holly and Tracy. I want to first thank you for the countless hours of entertainment and learning you've gifted me. Facts I've learned from your podcast have contributed answers to our trivia team numerous times, and we have a pretty winning team. Attached, you'll find a photo of my Gene Stratton Porter collection. It was passed from my great-grandma to my gramps, then on to me. With these and countless other books, they also passed to me a great love of reading. My grandparents read to me from infancy and turned me into a very early reader. Though my gramps was the busiest man I've ever known, you never saw him without a book in his hand. He read so intently and quickly, it was hard for him to keep reading material at hand, so he read anything and everything, even Harlequins. In my adult years, we traded stacks of books at a time and loved to discuss them. My 30-year-old daughter is the same kind of voracious reader. She happened to come in as I was snapping the photo of the books and exclaimed, 'Oh, The Harvester, that is such a great book.' She's read them all repeatedly, also from a young age. I had to confiscate my Stephen King from that girl when she was too young for them. Anyway, that was my roundabout way of saying the Gene Stratton Porter episode brought back many memories of my grandpa and our reading adventures. I was also charmed by most of her story and find her so intriguing. Also attached is my pet tax. Rebel, the pink-nosed kitty, is the oldest sister, followed by Scout, the very sweet Tortie. Their brothers are Andy, the golden retriever mix, and Pilot, the Australian cattle dog. I had to include an extra pic of Andy, who frisbeed so hard he crass-stained his head.
Oh, no.
We may be empty nesters, but we have a very lively household with much gratitude, Kelly. Thank you so much, Kelly. So this picture of the Gene Stratton Porter collection We've got At the Foot of the Rainbow, Laddie, The Keeper of the Bees, A Girl of the Limberlost, The Harvester, and Freckles. One of the things about getting older is it becomes less possible to really remember whether you're remembering something because you remember it or whether you're remembering something just because you have been exposed to it so many times. And I could not for sure tell you whether Laddie is one of the books that was on the bookshelf at my grandmother's house when I was a kid, or if I just saw so many photos of Laddie while I was working on that episode that it seems familiar to me. Yeah. Don't really know. So anyway, these are, just a collection of like the lovely old hardcover books with, the weathered covers. And then, oh my goodness, just some adorable, adorable cats and adorable dogs. All of them making like the interested big eye, let me look at your face. And so picture number last, as referenced with frisbeeing too hard. We have a little puppy dog with just like one little blotch of grass stain right in the middle of the forehead.
I love it.
Extremely cute. Thank you so much, Kelly, for this email and for sending all of these great pictures. If you would like to write to us about this or any other podcast or a history podcast at iHeartRadio.com, and you can subscribe to our show on the iHeartRadio app or wherever you like to get your podcasts. Stuff You Missed in History Class is a production of iHeartRadio. For more podcasts from iHeartRadio, visit the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows.